Hi, welcome to another session on the Art of Meditation Global Summit. My name is Fleet Mall, your co-host for this session, and I'm really thrilled to be here today with longtime friend and colleague, Dr. Richard Davidson. Welcome.
Thank you, Fleet. It's great to be here, and thank you for doing what you're doing.
Well, it's really a privilege to have you be part of this. You've been part of some of our summits before, and I always look forward to our conversations. So I'm going to share a bit of your bio, and then we'll jump right in. So Dr. Richard Davidson, who also is known as Richie Davidson to his friends and colleagues, received his PhD from Harvard University in psychology in 1976. His research is broadly focused on the neural basis of emotion and emotional style and methods to promote human flourishing, including meditation and related contemplative practices. He has published over 602 articles, numerous chapters and reviews, and edited 17 books. Is the author with Sharon Begley of The Emotional Life of Your Brain, published in 2012, and co-author with Daniel Goleman of Altered Traits, published in 2017. He was named one of the 100 most influential people in the world by Time magazine in 2006. He was elected to the National Academy of Medicine in 2017 and appointed to the governing board of UNESCO's Mahatma Gandhi Institute of Education and Peace and Sustainable Development in 2018. In 2014, Dr. Davidson founded the nonprofit Healthy Minds Innovations, which translates science into tools to cultivate and measure well-being. Dr. Davidson, you've been researching meditation for a long time. And I know that probably a couple of decades ago, the Dalai Lama asked you if you could apply the methodologies of scientific research to the study of positive emotions rather than just pathology, as much psychological and neuroscience research focuses on. And so your career has emphasized that study. And so I wonder if you could share perhaps how the findings from neuroscience over the last couple of decades have influenced our approach to meditation in the West, both secular and others, and perhaps your own practice as well. Have ways in which traditional practices have been influenced, and then the way in which the current kind of mainstream synthesis of things has been influenced.
Yeah. So first, thank you so much for having me, Fleet, and thank you for hosting this really amazing summit. As you described it to me, I can't think of any other compendium of knowledge and practices that exists that covers this extraordinary range across all these different traditions. So I think it will be an enormously valuable contribution. With regard to the role of neuroscience, there are a number of things to say. There are several insights from neuroscience that I think are broadly applicable to meditation and the study of meditation. One of them, of course, is the great insight of neuroplasticity. I'm sure viewers have heard that term before, and it's a term that really is a placeholder for a whole variety of mechanisms that represent ways in which the brain responds to training and experience. We know that the brain changes in response to experience and in response to training, and the way it responds is complex and there are different mechanisms of neuroplasticity, and there's still much to be discovered about how neuroplasticity supports the changes that occur with meditation. But one of the really most important insights is captured in the title of the book that I wrote with Dan Goleman, Altered Traits, which of course is a play on the term altered states. And when we meditate, when we put our butts on the cushion, primarily it's not for the experience we have while we're meditating. We put our butts on the cushion to impact every nook and cranny of our everyday lives. And that we think of as a trait effect, that is an altered trait. It's a way that our being is impacted in an enduring fashion that permeates everything that we do. And the way in which meditation has these enduring effects is presumably associated with some mechanisms of neuroplasticity. Certainly, that's not the only mechanism that supports the enduring changes that we see, but it clearly represents one of the key mechanisms. And so that insight, I think, is very, very important because it helps to give us a handle, if you will, on understanding in a rigorous scientific way how meditation may bring about the kind of beneficial changes that we and many other scientists have been documenting. So that's one aspect. There's a second way in which a very important insight from neuroscience, I think, is pertinent to our understanding of the impact of meditation, and that is that there are two fundamentally different kinds of learning that have been discerned through neuroscientific analysis. One of those forms of learning we call declarative learning. And declarative learning is learning about stuff, learning conceptually. So, for example, we can learn the value of kindness, and that can actually be very helpful to learn the ways in which kindness may beneficially impact human relationships and so forth. But even casual inspection, I think, will convince most people that simply learning about kindness will not necessarily make you a kinder person. You can read books about kindness, you can attend lectures about kindness, but that doesn't necessarily make you a kinder person. And there are other kinds of skills that are more extremely like this. So we can take learning a musical instrument as an example. You can't learn to play a musical instrument by reading books and attending lectures. That may be helpful as background, but you'll never be able to play the violin if that's all you do. And so there's a second form of learning that we call procedural learning. Procedural learning is skill-based. It is acquired through practice, and we know that it is instantiated in neural systems that are different from declarative learning. Now, when it comes to meditation and contemplative practice, both of those forms of learning are important. Both are necessary. But we, in the West, we tend to privilege declarative learning. Our universities are bastions of declarative learning. And we have relatively neglected procedural learning in the academy. And procedural learning is really essential in order to build the skills that we're trying to train in meditation practices. So those are two insights from neuroscience, one around plasticity and the other around these two forms of learning that I think are really important to understanding the effects of meditation.
So in terms of how neuroscientific findings have influenced how meditation is taught and practiced here in the West, personally, and this comes both from my own experience over the years, but then very much assisted by what I understand about the neuroscience that I read, is I've taken steadily a much, much more embodied approach to doing my own practice and teaching meditation over the last several decades. And I realized in talking about the brain, especially with a neuroscientist of your stature, there's always a danger of oversimplifying things and going to what gets popularized. But there's been a lot made of the the default mode network, both in talking about meditation and in the current emerging psychedelic assisted psychotherapy and so forth, that when that tends to go offline a bit or be suppressed a bit, we gain access to other parts of the brain. And it does seem like even the simple exercise of trying to thread a needle, most of us have had that experience, and that at least for a moment, because we're focusing, our mind gets very quiet. We may not be able to sustain that. But it seems by really emphasizing feeling the body, like developing a deeply felt presence of the body, we don't have to struggle so much with thoughts. The mind tends to quiet down, attention tends to stabilize, and we gain more access to awareness kind of without having to struggle with our mind. And for me, that understanding and then deepening my own personal experience of that working, feeling that working, has certainly been informed, at least by what I've read and understood from current research. So I'm wondering if you feel that's at all accurate, or want to extrapolate on that.
I think you are alluding to something quite important that has been well studied in modern neuroscientific approaches to meditation. One of the ways in which it's been framed is some scientists have talked about a narrative mode and an experiential mode of experiencing the self. We can engage with the self in a narrative mode. We can engage with the self in an experiential mode. The narrative mode is one that is based in the default mode. It is the narrative that all of us have in our minds about ourselves. It often is verbal, and it is this running dialogue that we have in our minds about who it is that we think we are. And the experiential mode is very much somatically based. It's embodied. It represents a totally different network in the brain. And so you can take moderately experienced meditation practitioners and have them shift from a narrative mode into an experiential mode, and you can see these networks in the brain correspondingly shift as well. So, so this is important. And, you know, it's not about getting rid of the default mode. The default mode plays a very important and adaptive role. And after all, our minds were, at least in part, designed to think. And this is what human minds do. And so it's not about getting rid of our thoughts. It's not about getting rid of the narrative, but it's rather changing our relationship to this narrative, which is really what is so critically important. And the way that shows up neuroscientifically is not so much in a suppression of the default mode, but it's rather in the altered connectivity between the default network and other networks in the brain that reflect this changing our relationship to the narrative.
Mm. Yeah, that term suppression is sometimes used in the psychedelic science. But my understanding, there's another network known as the task positive network, sometimes the executive network. So focused attention, and in my own experience, focusing on feeling the body, activates that network. And at least to one degree, those networks are somewhat mutually inhibitory to the extent that you bring one online, the other one is maybe not suppressed, but not as dominant. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and the default network can be suppressed in situations like that. But the problem with that strategy is that when the default mode network is suppressed, it will come back and raise its,
Right.
its ugly head, so to speak, as soon as the episode is over. And so it's not an enduring solution. And so the only enduring solution really is to change one's relationship to the default mode, because it will always be present.
So thus the importance of the attitudinal qualities that of course, John Kabat-Zinn and promotes an MBSR, but also another tradition of self-acceptance, self-compassion, allowing beginner's mind, these kind of things, so that we're befriending our experience. But I think at the same time, at least to get people started, instead of just constantly struggling with their thoughts, and I can't meditate, my mind races too much, and they're bouncing, they're doing a practice kind of up here in the head, and it's lost in thought, come back, lost in thought, come back. Something that gives them a little bit of a gap there, something I think can facilitate feeling something other than just a busy mind that they can't seem to get handled.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I agree.
I'm also wondering about the research. Generally, most meditation traditions begin with some emphasis on shifting our attention to our present moment experience of the body and the breath, physical sensation of the body and the breath. Now, you can take anything as the object of mindfulness, other sense perceptions, thoughts, emotions. It seems like the most readily available and more tangible, more accessible one is the body and the breath. And so in terms of that, I wonder if there's research. My understanding is that sensation, tactile physical sensation on the surface of the skin, travels through a particular set of neural networks that are highly myelinated, leaving us very sensitive to external touch. Internal sensation goes through a different set of neural networks, perhaps less myelinated, so it's more subtle. But I wonder if, directing our attention to either or both, if there's research there. And also, I think there is research showing that enhancing our ability to feel the body sort of from the inside out, so to speak, interoception or interoceptive awareness, that enhanced interoceptive awareness is connected to some of these qualities that we hope arise from meditation practice.
Yeah, so you've introduced many wonderful ideas and concepts, Fleet, and we can take them sort of in turn. Toward the end of this question, you were asking about interoception. Interoception refers to our ability to perceive bodily processes, internal bodily processes. For example, to perceive our heart beating is one aspect of interoception. And scientists have begun to study interoception in a serious and rigorous way. We know something about the brain mechanisms that support interoception. There's an area in the brain called the insula that is an area that has a viscerotopic map. It's the only part of the brain that has a viscerotopic map. And what we mean by that is that different visceral organs are geographically mapped onto different locations of the insula. And this is a part of the brain that really is very important in mediating mind-brain-body interaction. And so when we enter what I was earlier calling and more experiential mode of self-processing, and what you were referring to as an embodied mode, we're presumably engaging the insula, at least in part, in doing that. Now, with regard to interoception, it's probably not a monolithic process. That is, it's probably the case that people differ in their interoceptive ability for different aspects of interoception. So we can feel our heartbeat, we can feel our breathing, we may be able to feel sensations in the gut. And we don't know yet whether a person who's good at feeling her or his heartbeat is also good at interoception of the gut, for example. That has not been systematically studied. But one thing that has been studied, because it's really been the most well-developed in the scientific literature on interoception, is our capacity to perceive our own heartbeat. And I can tell you pretty definitively that meditators are not any better at this than anybody else. So they're more confident that they're better at it, but they're not actually better at it. That's what the research shows. So this is a case where we've been very um, committed to publishing whatever findings we get in our scientific explorations. And we've published two papers on interoceptive ability in very experienced meditators. And they're not any better at it than people off the street who've never done any practice.
Mm.
It's quite interesting, and it may be that we're asking about, and these are objective measures; they're not self-report measures, but we're measuring, in this case, a person's ability to experience their heartbeat, and it may be that if we measure other interoceptive capacities, we'd find something very different. And this is why I preface this by saying that interoception is probably not monolithic, and there's probably some important variation that may occur.
Well, I think it's just, and again, from what you said about the research on interoception, I think it would be interesting to see studies on other, interoceptive awareness of other aspects of our internal processes, and also maybe whether those people who seem to be innately better at interoception, whether they have any greater facility with meditation. It might be interesting to know that.
Yeah, yeah, I agree, and that would be very interesting. That's never really been definitively studied in any kind of systematic way. And yeah, and it's interoception is a tricky one. Excessive interoceptive sensitivity may also not be the best thing. And it turns out that people with panic disorder have very high levels of interoceptive sensitivity. So they any change that they detect in their heart, they may interpret as this threatening event, and so they exaggerate, if you will, and amplify the experience in ways that could be deleterious.
Mm. Yeah, that's a whole nother conversation we could have. My experience, I've worked with a lot of students that experience anxiety to one degree or another, fairly pronounced anxiety disorders, and I've really worked with trying to normalize that experience, that there is that the sensitivity, it's good. It's what they're doing with the sensitivity that becomes debilitating or creates cycles of how they're interpreting it. But the sensitivity itself means there may be more sensitive than others, and that could be a good thing.
Yeah.
Let's look at the other side of things for a moment. So you've been involved in studies and dialogue with His Holiness the Dalai Lama for several decades at least, primarily through the Mind and Life Institute, and you've also had a contemplative practice yourself, to my understanding. And so I'm wondering how this has informed your scientific pursuits. Your training as a Western neuroscientist is in a fairly materialist paradigm where it begins, despite quantum physics and all of that. It's mainstream science is pretty materialist, and the Eastern perspective. Even though I know the Holy Dalai Lama has been very open to going with, and really interested in Western science perspective and seeing what is affirmed there. At the same time, one, I think, could say that the Eastern approach, the yogic science, often puts consciousness as more primary than materiality. It's a little different perspective. So I just wonder what influence this intersection with the contemplative world and the world of Eastern practice and philosophy and Buddhism in particular has had on your approach to neuroscience, how it's influenced your neuroscientific investigations and maybe even the field of neuroscience. I know sometimes there's a term called contemplative neuroscience, I believe, is used.
Yeah. Yeah. So those are, great and important questions. And I would say that first, sort of at a broad level, there's no question that my own meditation practice, which, now is more than 40 years of daily practice, as well as retreat practice, has certainly influenced my views as a neuroscientist. And, it's influenced the views in many different ways. I mean, the knee-jerk reaction in modern Western science is that the mind is an emergent property of the brain. And actually, if you go on the website of the MIT's Department of Brain and Cognitive Science, which is, a really wonderful department with some fantastic scientists that I have a lot of respect for as scientists, but they say, pretty unequivocally that the mind is what the brain does. And to me, that's like, for smart people, it's a really narrow idea. And to me, it can't be right, even from a materialist perspective, because we know that the body informs the mind. We know that there are pathways from the gut. There are 200 million neurons in the gut that bathe the brain in modulatory signals. And so to say that the mind is just what the brain does is ridiculous and very limited. So, and any meditator who, you began by talking about the importance of kind of an embodied way of practicing, and even getting a small taste of that is enough to convince you that there's more to the mind than exists in the brain per se. Now, clearly you're alluding to yet other and more challenging sorts of notions that consciousness may in some way be primary, that there may not be an isomorphic relationship between the mind and the brain. And, as both a practicing scientist and a practicing meditator, this is where I believe that the practice of humility is really most important. And really practicing not knowing, which is really very much how I approach this. And so, putting on my scientific hat, I certainly don't see convincing evidence that the mind can exist separately from the brain. But there's certainly no definitive evidence that it doesn't, that there isn't some capacity of the mind that can occur independent of the brain. And we ourselves are engaged in this crazy project that His Holiness the Dalai Lama asked me to do with dying yogis who putatively go into a state after the conventional Western definition of death, where they still have, according to tradition, some residual level of awareness, and the body does not decompose. And in certain cases, they're actually sitting in an upright position when they die, in a meditating posture. And we've studied now more than 20 cases of Tukdam in India. And I've personally witnessed one case myself. So, this is obviously not something that you can experimentally produce in the laboratory. You have to wait for its natural occurrence. But I did have the opportunity, which was very powerful for me to see. And I'm convinced that there's something unusual going on. I also feel like we have no idea what it is that's going on. And so we are very slowly and incrementally documenting some of these observations and trying to take this one step at a time. But this is, one case where there is a challenge to the conventional Western understanding. And, I don't know where it's going to lead. I think that it's really important that we just be open and see where it takes us. And that's kind of how I'm approaching it. So, yeah, that's how I really think about it. Many people I know who are very long-term meditation practitioners um, live in this world and report things to me which I can't explain in my scientific framework, and my response to it is not to dismiss it, and but also not to accept as reality everything I hear. So I'm very comfortable living in this place of not knowing.
I think that's a good place to be. And I really appreciate that you pointed to that. And I think, that's really pure science to come from that place of humility and not knowing. And sometimes established science is just, a generational exchange of knowings, which are clung to desperately until the next one gains dominance. So coming from not knowing and humility as a scientist sounds quite wonderful. Well, let's dive back into meditation methodology itself. I think it's fairly common across traditions that meditation practices and techniques have some kind of stabilizing technique, something to begin to calm the mind down, to maybe shift our relationship to the thinking mind a bit, to be less caught by it, or just be able to have a little more attention, a little more focus. And so in the Tibetan and other Buddhist traditions, this would be called shamatha, or been translated as calm abiding. In the mainstream, maybe in Theravada, but also in mainstream mindfulness, it's often called focused attention. And then there are usually that can lead into practices that are more awareness focused and leading to what might be called liberating awareness. And at least in the Buddhist traditions, I think in other traditions point to that ultimate liberation comes out of some insight, some knowing of the nature of mind, how things actually are. And so there's these two balances, which in Buddhist terms are called shamatha and vipassana, or calm abiding and maybe insight meditation sometimes. And I see this across other traditions as well, in other faith traditions and other philosophical traditions and so forth. It seems to be these two elements. There also maybe could be a third element that actually being in a deep state of meditation, being in a deep samadhi, just having that experience also brings about some change. I had a very interesting discussion with Dr. Tony Nader, who's the current he's a Harvard-trained physician and an MIT-trained neuroscientist, and he's also current head of the TM movement, Worldwide Transcendental Meditation Movement. And he talked about, in the value of the experience of deep samadhi as an experience and how that could change and really, but then I kind of pursued with him, well, at some point there need to somehow be a knowing of that experience for there to be the ultimate. And he said, yeah, I think there is maybe a bit of a rising out of samadhi in order to have the knowing of that experience on some level that could be part of the liberating factor. But for most of it, it's probably just enough to talk about the calm abiding or shamatha stabilizing factor, and then the awareness insight factor. And I'm curious about the research on any of that. How much research has been done around these different aspects of various techniques? I know your research has involved mainstream mindfulness, but I believe you've also done research with Tibetan Buddhist practitioners as well. And so I'm just curious about where the research is around meditation methodology.
Yeah, that's important. And one of the things to point out, which will be obvious to anyone who goes through this entire summit, and that is that not all forms of meditation are the same. There's a lot of diversity, and they don't do the same thing. And so there has been much more research on basic mindfulness, focused attention practice, and shamatha than there has been on insight. There's really been very little research specifically on insight practices. And
Mm.
of course, insight, as you know, Fleet, can be cultivated in a number of different ways. And in some um, branches of the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, one of the primary ways of cultivating insight is with analytic meditation,
Mm.
which is the primary practice of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And that has been, there's virtually no research in the West on analytic meditation, essentially zero. Um, and so, there's still a long way to go. Part of it is that in order to do research, we need a pool of practitioners, if you will, that have all been trained in a very similar or identical way. And that's, it's becoming more and more possible, obviously, to do that today in the West. But 10 years ago, it was less possible. Um, so I think we'll see more of that. But uh, the yeah, so the majority of work in the scientific literature is really focused on shamatha type practices and emphasizes changes in the brain in networks that are important for regulating attention and a little bit on meta awareness. But, really almost nothing on insight per se.
Mm-hmm.
So, we certainly think a lot about it. We have a lot of ideas about it. But, we're still very much at the early stages of this work too.
Mm-hmm. And of course, Alan Wallace did if I have at Santa Barbara, didn't he do the shamatha studies? So I have the right name. I hope I'm pulling that
Yes.
correctly out of my memory. Yeah, extensive studies there. So have there been any studies done with Mahamudra or Dzogchen practices, more fruition Mahamudra or Dzogchen practitioners, where there is kind of a resting in the nature of mind or a more non-dual approach to practice?
Yeah, I mean, there's been some, and our 2004 paper on high amplitude gamma oscillations in long-term practitioners was done with practitioners who were practicing Mahamudra and Dzogchen, and who were basically doing nature of mind practice,
Mm-hmm.
non-dual recognition of the nature of mind, and so we very much think that the gamma signals that we see in that kind of practice may reflect the kind of panoramic awareness that is phenomenologically reported during nature of mind practice. Uh, so there hasn't been that much work done on it, in part because these to remain stably in that state probably requires a fair amount of practice, particularly in the strange confines of an MRI scanner. And so yeah, there has been still just a modest amount of work done with that, but the data are quite compelling in showing that there are indeed distinct neural signatures of that kind of practice.
Mm-hmm. And I believe, I think you have done research as well. I know there's been research done on the metta practice or the loving kindness practice. I wonder if you could say something about that.
Yeah, so there's been quite a bit that's been done on metta or loving kindness or compassion,
Mm-hmm.
all of which are kind of near neighbors
Mm-hmm.
um, over the last decade. And one of the things we know is that those practices activate different neural circuits compared with mindfulness or awareness practices. There's evidence to suggest that they activate circuits that we know are explicitly involved in emotion. There are parts of the brain that are involved in positive emotion. that we know are activated during these practices. We also know that there are parts of the brain that are important in perspective taking and sort of theory of mind, where you can really sort of step into the shoes of another, and certain kinds of compassion practices activate those circuits as well.
Mm-hmm. So in your book, The Emotional Life of the Brain of Your Brain, you discuss different emotional styles, and I'm wondering if maybe with both traditional mindfulness awareness practices as well as some of the compassion practices, how that affects our emotional style, our emotional balance, self-regulation, emotion regulation. I think there is research that demonstrates that over time, mindfulness practitioners tend to have greater emotional balance or greater capacity for emotion regulation. But I wonder if you could talk about that. And then maybe we could even talk about working with difficult emotions.
Yeah, so, I think that one of the big domains, if you will, that has been studied so far, where we see really beneficial effects of meditation in general, is on our capacity to regulate our emotions. And, I think the evidence is quite clear in suggesting that various kinds of meditation may be helpful in improving our capacity to regulate our emotions. And this is true of both awareness practices as well as metta or compassion practices. Both kinds of practices help in emotion regulation. And there's, lots of different evidence for that. There's evidence at the neural level. There's evidence at the behavioral level. I think that work is quite compelling. To give one specific example to sort of bring this home, is work we did with physical pain. That's a kind of face valid emotional stimulus, if you will, that we can deliver safely in the laboratory, but it's real. And everyone has had the experience of physical pain, and this is real pain that we deliver with heat, but we can deliver it in a way which is really safe and ethical and does not produce any damage to the person. And what we see is that meditation has two important, really three effects. One is that one of the biggest problems in pain is that people anticipate experiencing pain, and the anticipation itself causes distress, and it amplifies the pain. So meditation dramatically decreases that anticipatory experience.
Mm-hmm.
The second is on the other side. It's on the recovery side. And so when a painful stimulus occurs, we often ruminate about it and perseverate, and that further accentuates the pain, and it leads to a very slow recovery. And one of the things we find that meditation does, particularly awareness practices, they decrease the duration of the activation. So they lead to a faster recovery. So that's the second. And the third, paradoxically, is that during the actual painful stimulus itself, when something painful is occurring, the mind and the brain is actually open and accepting. And so you actually see heightened activation in certain areas of the brain in response to the pain, not diminished activation. So, there are some stereotypes that meditation makes you an emotional zombie. Well, that's just not true. It's not true from casual observation. and it's not true at the level of the brain. In fact, you react more to the emotional stimuli, in this case to a painful stimulus, but you just react to it more adaptively. So you show a big response when it's appropriate, but once the noxious stimulus goes away, you recover very quickly. And that's kind of the neural signature of resilience.
Mm. Yeah, that leads into, I was going to ask you for our audience to avoid any misunderstanding that when we talk about emotion regulation and adaptive or healthy emotion regulation, we're not referencing anything that is like suppressing emotions or bypassing emotions, but it's really changing our relationship.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I've had the honor of being around the Dalai Lama a lot, and as a kind of lifelong student of emotion, the Dalai Lama's emotional demeanor has always been of great interest to me. And he is someone who's very emotional, really emotional. In fact, I've gone on record in saying this. He has the greatest dynamic range of emotion of any human being I've ever met.
Mm.
And by that, I mean, he can go from a state where, I mean, I've seen this myself where, he listens to someone describing their suffering and he's crying. And then the next moment, just like that, he's laughing because something funny has occurred. And it's just this total fluidity. There's no getting stuck. It's just responding in a very context appropriate way, which leads to this huge dynamic range of emotion, much more than an average adult.
Mm. Which could be perhaps one definition of emotional health is having that enhanced range.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, you've also, through your research, done a lot of research on well-being and human flourishing, thriving, and resilience. You just mentioned, and I believe you've identified some constituents to well-being, such that we can actually sort of train ourselves we can intentionally increase our level of well-being, and this can be, I suppose, probably physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual well-being. It could also point in the direction of what's sometimes called eudaimonia well-being or psychological well-being, that sense of self-competency and so forth. Um, and so I believe you've identified actually some of the neural substrates involved in these, so that you can actually see how different interventions, like meditation, perhaps, and I believe those four. At least I know some kind of attention or mindfulness is one of them. I believe some kind of generosity or altruistic spirit is another. And I know there are two more. But I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit in terms of understanding our practice and how having a contemplative practice could at least support moving in a direction of human thriving, human flourishing, individually and collectively, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. So the four pillars of well-being, as we call them, are these. The first we call awareness, which is where mindfulness would be. We prefer the term awareness because there's so much surplus baggage associated with mindfulness.
Mm-hmm.
And also, it's not just mindfulness. There are other components of awareness that are important, like self-awareness and meta-awareness.
Mm-hmm.
The second component we call connection. And connection is about qualities that are important for healthy social relationships, qualities like appreciation and gratitude and kindness and compassion. The third pillar is insight. And insight is about, as we describe it, it's about self-knowledge and particularly a deep experiential understanding of the nature of the narrative that we all carry around about ourselves. And again, this is, going back to our earlier conversation, it's not about changing the narrative so much as it's changing our relationship to the narrative so that we can see the narrative for what it is. And finally, the last pillar of well-being is purpose. And purpose here is about identifying our true north in life, clarifying our our values. And again, it's not so much about finding something more purposeful to do with our lives, but how can we find meaning and purpose in that which we already do, including the pedestrian activities of daily living? Can taking out the garbage be really directly connected to your highest sense of purpose? And of course it could be. Everything could be. It just requires a little bit of reframing.
Mm. Yeah, that appreciation for ordinary life. That idea of first enlightenment and then the laundry or something, or in Zen, chop wood, carry water. And I think there's been some books written on the title, Ordinary Magic and things like that, of really appreciating that when we really drop in and tune in, relax into just being present with our daily activities, they can be quite inspiring and motivating. And can be a lot of joy found in very simple activities. Yeah.
Totally. Exactly.
I wonder if there's any connection between your research on well-being and flourishing, and you mentioned connection, quality of relationship being one of the 4 factors, and the long-running study of adult development at Harvard that's currently directed by our colleague Robert Waldinger, who also happens to be a Zen priest as well as a researcher. And that study seems to point to that the quality of relationships is almost the leading contributor, identified contributor to health and well-being, longevity, and many other factors.
Yeah, so I think that's a really important study, and the insight about social connection, I think, is super important. And there's no doubt that that social connection is a really important ingredient. And not too long ago, the Surgeon General of the United States, just a few months ago, issued an urgent health advisory for the United States, and it's an advisory on loneliness and social isolation. And one of the things that he points out in that report is that loneliness is actually a greater risk factor for premature mortality than is smoking 15 cigarettes a day.
Mm.
And so, this is real. This gets under the skin. This is not just an ephemeral subjective state, but this is, in your terms, Fleet, this is an embodied quality. So it's super important. I think there are other factors that are equally important. One of the things we know is that in the later decades of life, having a strong sense of purpose is also an extremely important ingredient in human flourishing and in healthy living. And in fact, some research indicates that among people who are 70 years and older, the single most important psychological predictor of longevity is having a strong sense of purpose in life.
Mm. I wonder another thing that's especially in acceptance commitment therapy, in that model, the term psychological flexibility is used. And I wonder if that sounds like another way to describe kind of some of the fruits of this, or Dr. Dan Siegel's window of tolerance, that we're able to be with a greater bandwidth of our experience in a more responsive relational way. And it takes a little more to trigger us into unresourced or reactive, habitual, fear-based ways or fight or flight responses to things. So I'm wondering if you see that psychological flexibility as one of these characteristics of thriving. And
yes, absolutely. I think that's a really important comment, and I completely agree. And earlier, I was talking about the emotional fluidity of the Dalai Lama, and in some sense, that is kind of an extreme exemplar, if you will, of psychological flexibility.
Absolutely. Just the last question, and there's so many rabbit holes we could go down here. I'm really having to resist it. But I wonder if there's any research, connection to research on flow states. Now, there are the flow states that are gained through some kind of intense focused activity like rock climbing or things, and athletes and performers often experience these flow states. But there also seem to be a kind of broader flow states that may be similar to meta awareness or even to levels of samadhi on some level. But there seems to be, as we're able to really relax and drop into deeper levels of meditative experience, there seems to be a sense of an experiential, through interoceptive awareness, a kind of an experiential kind of almost physical, as well as I'm sure it's cognitive, emotional as well, kind of flow state that does seem to have a very supportive, nurturing quality and could have a very healing quality. So I wonder if there's been any research around that and connected to your work.
Yeah, so I'm glad you asked about flow, because this is an area that it has, there's a lot of interest, but also I think a lot of misunderstanding. So flow is a term that was first proposed by a psychologist by the name of Csikszentmihalyi. And there have been a variety of different groups that have been studied, including folks like rock climbers, where the activity that these people were pursuing is such that they're completely merged with the activity. And in certain cases, like in cases with rock climbers, if there's a lapse of attention, it could even be lethal. And one sort of this is really it's a related but different question, is the question of why is it that people put themselves in life-threatening situations in order to be in a flow state. That is saying something, I think, important about the seductiveness, if you will, of flow states, or their positive appeal in certain ways. So, and what you also mentioned, which I completely agree with, that flow can happen in lots of different other contexts. Musicians talk about being in flow. Athletes talk about being in flow. It's commonly reported in these different arenas. And here's the kicker. Flow can occur with or without meta-awareness. Most of the time, I would say flow occurs without meta-awareness. People are completely absorbed in what they're doing. And one metaphor that we like to use to help people appreciate this with common experience is to ask viewers whether they've ever had the experience of being in a movie theater where they're watching a movie and they're so engrossed in the movie that they lose awareness that they're in the theater. They're just completely immersed in the plot. And I think many of us have had that experience, and that would be akin to flow without meta-awareness. But we can also be in a movie theater where we're totally paying attention to the movie, unwaveringly, but we recognize that we're in a movie theater and what we're seeing is a movie. And actually, that's the way life is. I mean, the brain is constructing what we're seeing. And just like a dream, there's no difference between our perception of, quote, reality and our perception of a dream. It's literally the same thing in the brain. It's the same construction. But we often fail to recognize that. We're so immersed in it. If flow occurred all the time with meta-awareness, I think we would see athletes and musicians much more likely to have enlightened qualities. And by and large, they don't, at least not in my personal experience. I think that this is really a key feature that needs to be recognized.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you brought forth that distinction. And to use your analogy of it being at a movie theater, one can be in a sense of flow so that you're really enjoying the movie and you're emotionally connected to the movie and still have meta awareness.
Totally.
And so the parallel to that And everything we've been talking about, how we could be in our lives and be connected to our lives without being completely lost in the narrative, and be able to feel, have all the experiences, but still have that meta awareness.
Exactly.
Yeah. Dr. Richard Davidson, where can people find out more about your work? I know there's a center at UW, University of Wisconsin, and you also have a nonprofit.
So if they go to centerforhealthyminds.org, they can use that as the portal to learn more about our work. And the practice that I did was snippets of awareness, connection, insight, and purpose, the 4 key pillars of well-being. And we've put that into a freely available app. It's totally free. And it's the only meditation app that actually is evidence-based. And the New York Times Wirecutter named it as one of the 3 best meditation apps for 2023. It's called the Healthy Minds Program, and you can get it wherever you download apps.
Wonderful. Wow. What an offering. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And just thank you for being part of this and for the incredible work that you do. And many blessings on that work going forward, and wish you the best.
Thank you, Fleet. You too.